Thank you and good afternoon. I'm Arne Jacobson, Director of the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, and also one of the leads for the Pacific Offshore Wind Consortium, which involves collaboration with Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Cal Poly Humboldt, and Oregon State University, and I know there are people from all three of our universities here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grid interconnection and transmission, give us a bit of a status update and some notes about the way forward. And I'd like to start with my conclusions, because that's always a good place to start a story. When it comes to the North Coast, the California Independent System Operator has approved a set of projects to support transmission for offshore wind on the North Coast. There's sufficient capacity to meet the needs of the Humboldt wind energy area. They've selected a project or a fiscal sponsor or a project developer, and the fiscal sponsor has early planning activities underway. So things are not in a bad position from the perspective of that moving forward. On the Central Coast, in relationship to the Morro Bay wind energy area, there's existing transmission infrastructure that could support initial offshore wind development, but for full build-out of that wind energy area, additional investment to build out additional capacity would be needed for that full build-out. But there is some capacity there that could be used to get started. Transmission is an area where the state is in the lead. The state is in the driver's seat, and those processes are largely in the hands of the state and the private sector partners that they bring on. There are some federal permits that are needed, and we'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. And then when it comes to risks associated with transmission development, and here focusing on the North Coast where there is an approved project, like I think almost all overland large transmission projects, permitting and rights-of-way acquisition are a significant challenge. So this isn't different from other projects, but those challenges are there. I think in this moment, the biggest risk factor, though, is associated with federal interference with offshore wind more broadly, and I think importantly, how the private sector and the state respond to that interference. And I know that there are efforts underway currently to mitigate those risks, but they're not. They are present, and I think we're all aware of those. California, of course, has a broad portfolio for meeting its climate and clean energy goals with a number of different generation and transmission projects associated with that. Offshore wind is part of that wider portfolio, so it's important to understand it as being part of a pretty big portfolio of things that the state is driving forward. Another way to situate offshore wind and the transmission to support it is to think in terms of the infrastructure pieces associated with developing offshore wind. I like to think of offshore wind as being four major interdependent endeavors: the wind farms themselves, port development for various functions, the transmission, and then ports and workforce. Supply chain and workforce. Each of those four types of infrastructure involves its own set of developers and its own regulatory and permitting processes. So they're interdependent, but also separate in their own ways. And then each is situated differently with respect to the federal, state, and private sector nexus. Development of offshore wind is you can think of the federal government, the state government, and the private sector as really three legs of a stool, and they all need to be there for the stool to be well balanced. Of the four areas of development, I would say that transmission is the least dependent on the federal piece, and is the one that the the state has the most autonomy to drive forward together with the private sector. And so that puts us in an important position as something that the state can drive forward. Nonetheless, there are some federal permits that are required, and federal action does have some influence over what happens. I think just as an example, you can't really get from Humboldt to the I-5 corridor where points of interconnection for those transmission lines needs to be without going through Forest Service land and their associated permitting associated with that. This map shows the existing transmission system for California. The thicker lines indicate higher capacity transmission lines, and the thinner ones are, of course, lower capacity. And so seeing what that existing infrastructure looks like in relationship to the leased blocks in the two wind energy areas is useful. Humboldt has 2 leased blocks and estimated capacity for anywhere from 1.6 to 4 gigawatts of offshore wind. Morro Bay with 3 leased blocks with an estimated 3 to 6 gigawatts of potential capacity. That has implications for how much transmission is needed to be able to support that. Now, of course, if the federal buyout of the Golden State lease area holds, the Morro Bay wind energy area would drop down to 2 lease blocks. It's not clear that buyout is legal and that will hold, but if it does, that would have implications for transmission, because the amount of transmission, or excuse me, the amount of offshore wind that could be developed in that wind energy area would be reduced. Zooming in just on Humboldt for the moment, the Humboldt County's electrical system is relatively isolated from the main grid, and the electric load in that region is fairly small. The offshore wind potential in the Humboldt wind energy area is more than 20 times larger than the capacity of the existing system, and so obviously significant investments to upgrade facilities would be needed. The California Independent System Operator has approved transmission upgrades to support offshore wind development, including through a new 500 kilovolt substation and 2 500 kilovolt transmission lines, as well as a connection to the local system. CalGrid LLC, which is a subsidiary of Viridon, was selected as a fiscal sponsor for both of the primary projects. The original timeline for completion was late 2034. The CPUC has, my understanding, has recommended an extension of that to 2036. And then PG&E is responsible for infrastructure to connect between the new infrastructure and the local system. That part is very important because a lot of the local reliability and capacity benefits associated with developing this are only realized if you have that local connection. The transmission would be financed by CalGrid and with reimbursement coming from ratepayers in the California ISO balancing area. So it's useful to understand what is the cost implication for ratepayers. We've done some analysis at the Schatz Center and just released a report on this topic. And our analysis is that the cost of the average California ratepayer would be about $1.68 per year in raw costs. So it's relatively modest when spread across the entire rate base over a 50-year lifetime. In addition, there are system benefits that would be associated with that project that could reduce that further, or even perhaps eliminate that cost with a net positive outcome. Permitting is expected to begin perhaps in late 2027 or maybe even slightly after that. And of course, permitting and right-of-way acquisition will be major challenges in that context. Shifting over to the Central Coast, there are high-capacity transmission lines that come out to the coast to serve the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. There's also a 230 kilovolt substation at Morro Bay that's associated with a now retired natural gas plant. And those are those locations serve as possible interconnection points for offshore wind. If Diablo Canyon remains online past 2030, which I think at this point seems more likely than not, the California ISO estimates that there's up to 3 gigawatts of transmission capacity to support offshore wind without any additional upgrades. So that's enough to at least get started, although not enough for a full build out if that's as much as 6 gigawatts. Available capacity at the Morro Bay substation is more limited, and so if interconnection happens there, there would be a need for infrastructure upgrades. Coming back to the conclusions I started with, things are in a fairly good place in the process on the North Coast with respect to transmission. On the Central Coast, infrastructure that's already there could support initial development, but additional investment would be needed for a full build-out. The state controls the process to a large degree, although there is some federal dimension, and the biggest risk factor, I think, has to do with perhaps the private sector and the state not seeing offshore wind as viable could lead to the potential for the state changing its plans about that project, but there are, I think, efforts underway to diversify the use of that transmission and to therefore mitigate that risk. And with that, I will close. Thank you all very much.